Today on the podcast, we have Mike Rhodes. I asked Mike to join us because he has such an incredible story of his personal journey and bucket list item of climbing Mount Kilimanjaro. What an adventure, and I'm so glad he could share it with us. Here's the interview.
All right, I have Mike Rhodes with us on this episode of Goalpost. Mike, thank you for joining us. I appreciate you being here.
Yeah, sure.
So, Mike, I wanted to touch base with you. You've got such a unique personal journey. We do a lot of things on the podcast that talks about professional development and business conversations. And I was recently reminded about a personal story that you had shared with me. And I wanted to touch base on that story. But before we do, can you give us a little bit of background? Who is Mike Rhodes? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, basically, I am the guy that went through several years of college as well as graduate school to become an English professor, only to segue into the world of international stone trade, which I've been doing for the past 25 years. So I've been doing that, involved with projects all over North America, supplying marble, granite, that kind of things for buildings, working with architects on specifications and whatnot. And in my spare time, I've run a publishing company for music as well, pitched tunes for TV shows and things like that as well. So that's kind of who I am on the as far as the making money side, kind of having fun side, but also I guess to segue into this a little bit better, I'm the guy that you could ask to do anything, and I'd probably, as long as it's within reason, would be the one that would do it. So, yeah.
That's a great segue. That's where we're going. So you, a few years ago, not too long ago, you climbed Mount Kilimanjaro, which is a bucket list item for some folks. That's just the pinnacle of climbing. And so start with how that conversation and the thought of, hey, this is something I want to do. Where did this come from? Give us the background on this.
Well, oddly enough, ever since I was a little kid, I've always wished I could draw really well. And that was like the one thing, I could write well, I could compose music and do that. But I'm a stick figure guy. But I could always draw mountains really well because it just, jagged line or a smooth line. Anyway, I've always had a fascination with mountains. And it's something that I thought that at some point, I would do. I just didn't realize that at the young age of 49, it would turn into essentially a friend of my wife's calling me up who had gone blind essentially from a genetic disease called choroideremia. And he's, after a little bit of small talk said, hey, do you want to go climb the tallest, volcano and single standing mountain in the world? And I was like, yeah, it sounds cool. Where are you talking about? And that's when he said Kilimanjaro. And he had been climbing some mountains in Central America where he lives in Guatemala. And he was doing that to raise money for research for choroideremia. And so we kind of put this together as a way to raise money for finding a cure, because it's quantitatively, it's such a small audience of people that have it, that it's something that has to have private funding, because the drug companies don't see it being a situation where there's enough profit in it for them to go, at it aggressively. So that's kind of how that was the impetus for it. And then basically over a year's worth of training, doing hikes over in Percy Warner Park, and adding weight and to my backpack, breaking all the gear in, trying to learn as much as I could about it, and doing cryotherapy at my wife's place. That's what I did to get ready to go. And basically, my first hike that I'd ever been on being Mount Kilimanjaro.
That was the first one. So, talk to me about your friend. Did he have any concern? Did you have any concern? He's blind and wants to do this climb, and so you're basically agreeing to be his guide. Talk to me about that, and then how did you guys get started? Give us the rundown. I want to hear the full story.
Well, interestingly enough, Scott has been with this disease, of course, been going progressively blind for several years. And so he had ended up trying to find a place in the world where he could live, to more or less feel safe once he lost his eyesight. And Guatemala happened to be that place. As far as him reaching out to me, I think he thought, well, Mike's in about 240, so if I go down, I got somebody to pick me up. I think that's what it kind of came down to. It wasn't, much of a cerebral thing. It's just like I think he has the physical strength to maybe pull me out of a ditch or pick me up and throw me over his shoulder if that happens to get to that point. But primarily that's kind of where the whole thing just started with was he just thought that I was a good fit for that. And again, it goes back to the beginning where I'm the guy that you could say, hey, would you do this? And he pretty much knew that I would say I'd want to do that. So and as far as getting ready for it, at first it was daunting, but the more you got into it and really for me it became almost like medicine to be able to go over in the woods and just walk up and down the hills for an hour and continually push myself to do more and more and more, still not having really any idea of what a more than a 2 hour or 3 hour hike would entail, because we're talking about essentially the route that we took being 60 miles and having an elevation change of about 14,000 feet and starting at about 6,000 feet. So essentially imagine starting at Denver, climbing to the highest mountain just outside of Denver at 14,000 feet, and then going up another, 5,000, 6,000 feet above that.
My
So
gosh.
that part you could only, mentally kind of run through your head, but you didn't let it run through too long because you would just be like, what am I doing? If you thought about it too much, you just had to just do it. So,
Right. So you took off. When did you depart for this journey, and how did you meet up with Scott, and what was the adventure like?
well, as with, it pretty much started off like, I guess like Odysseus, and essentially all plans as far as the trip were concerned completely went haywire from the get go. Started leaving here in Nashville, and I guess it was end of September 2018. And as I'm going to the airport, I see a huge cloud bank rolling in, and I'm going, "Oh no, this isn't cool." Well, sure enough, the flight from here to Atlanta was delayed, which meant I missed my flight there. So then it meant that I was not going to be able to meet Scott in Amsterdam, which had me freaked out because now there's a blind guy walking around Amsterdam trying to get on a plane to go to Africa. So the best they could do is put me on Air France into Paris, and then from Paris into it was Nairobi. And I had to ask, like, Nairobi, where the hell's Nairobi? I don't. And they're like, well, it's in Kenya. And I'm like, was that close to Tanzania? I'm like, I don't even have a reference of Africa right now to know where I'm going or anything. Oh yeah, it's right next to it. Okay, sure, let's do that. So into Paris, and then from Paris into Nairobi, essentially being seated next to probably the one guy on the plane who was a Frenchman that probably hadn't had a shower in 3 years, for 9 excruciating hours, and then getting into Nairobi, and it's like I emerged on a completely different planet. It was basically dashikis and everything that you would think you'd see in a Casablanca film, but it was like in an airport, and I was the lone 6'4" blonde haired white guy walking around, which was just it was wild. Like I said, it's like I emerged on a completely different planet. But then another flight from there into Tanzania, and then not realizing that the airport is over 3 hours away from Arusha. So it meant that I got in that night at about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. So didn't see Scott that night. Wasn't sure if everything was okay or not. Was hoping that he was there the next morning. And as it turned out, everything worked out fine for him. They treated him just with kid gloves. They once he got to the hotel, the all the restaurants were closed, but the people there were just super sweet. The one of the security guards actually took him to his room, helped him put his things up and everything, and then asked me if he'd eaten. And he said, "Well, no, I haven't, but I'm okay. I've got something." He's like, "No, no, no, no. I take you. We get you some food now. It's okay." And so he went and took him, woke up the guy in the restaurant, had him cook him some stuff, and then sat there and talked with him for an hour or so while he was eating stuff that evening. Just it's kind of, it was everything that you would kind of expect going to Africa, seeing the abject poverty and stuff like that, but also seeing a different side of it, in that seeing so much, just optimism and hope, and just, strong people that are just, I mean, it's beautiful. That part of it was. So we met that next morning for coffee, after, 2 days of traveling nearly. And we had one day to get ready to leave the next morning and head up. And so at that point, it was a long bus ride, because the route that we took was the longest route you can take, starting on the north side of Kilimanjaro, which is near Kenya. Um, it involves a little less. There's like no climbing; it's just all trekking. So that was better for Scott. But it just meant that we were going to be on a trail that was about 6 inches wide, versus the other side of the mountain, which is almost like a 4-lane highway where a lot of people try and come up because it's a quicker ascent. And a lot of the tour groups start on the south side of the mountain. So our trek was a lot more scenic. We didn't pass but maybe 5 people in 7 days the whole way going up there. And it was just complete, just serenity, and quiet. I mean, you stand still, and if the wind wasn't blowing, your heartbeat was deafening.
So you had a guide. How many people were in your group? And kind of tell us about the trek up. How far could you get in a day? How many days did it take? Walk us through that.
Well, we did. We had about 12 people that were our support group, which kind of freaked me out, because I was thinking, oh, I'll have like 1 or 2 porters, and Scott was going to have 2, and a guide. No, we had like a small platoon of guys that were going with us. So Scott had 2 guys, one that would walk behind him and one that would walk in front of him. And this was their groups. They had worked with some people with handicaps and disabilities in the past, but they'd never worked with a blind guy before. So it was a learning experience for them as well. And so the guy in front, they started figuring out, Scott, his hearing, like a lot of people that lose their sight, their other faculties really kick in. And so for him, his hearing was getting to the sense where the guy in front would tap on rocks to the left or right, and Scott could tell, and he would move, and it would cut down on the number of times that he would stumble or get off the trail and that kind of thing. And then going up an incline, the guy behind him, if Scott made a misstep and started to fall back, then the guy behind him would be there to kind of catch him. Once we got to the night or wherever we would camp for the night, Scott was on me at that point. So then it was like, he'd be doing this to get his cup and nearly knocking it over, because he's still very self-sufficient and that kind of thing. And I'd be like, whoa, dude, wait a minute, and I'd have to grab it, go get things and stuff like that. Let him kind of lead him out to where our little porta potty thing was at, and that kind of, the essentials essentially. But overall, we would typically do anywhere from a minimum of 6 to as many as 12 miles a day. Overall, it was a 7-day trip. And the absolute hardest part was the final, the day of the final ascent, which should have been, usually it's about, I think they do it in 8 or 9 hours. And we took somewhere around 14, 15 hours to do it. And part of it was, as we started going up such an intense incline, Scott would lose his balance a lot, and it would really kind of freak him out. He'd stop, and Then he had to catch his breathing and then kind of settle back down, and then we'd start walking again. So that whole part of it was just excruciatingly hard. At the same time, uh, about 3/4 of the way up the mountain, the final ascent, that morning, all of a sudden being able to see after being dark, because we were supposed to start at midnight, we started at 2 a.m. instead. Scott wanted to have more daylight time because he still has a little bit of peripheral vision, and he wanted to be able to maybe make something out if he could and be more in the light. So, but about 3/4 of the way up, all of a sudden, after having headlamps on, all of a sudden you could kind of see, and it was just like a little bit of a grayish light, and it's like, oh wow! I mean, it was just like that. And within just a matter of seconds, I stopped and was drinking some water and happened to turn and look. And there off in the distance was the sun breaking over the clouds for that morning. And you could see basically the entire curve of the earth. Yes, flat earthers, I hate to tell you this, but the earth is round. And as the sun comes up, essentially those rays create an effect which in Colorado they would call Alpenglow, but it was like super intense. And within a few seconds, we were just like in this like super just red, almost like just crazy color, like just being projected on us. And it only lasted for maybe 30 seconds, and then it was like gray rocks and stuff again. But that whole experience is just, knowing that we were that close and then having that happen was just like that little bit of like to make it to the top. And so we finally did make it to the top, and at that point that's where things started getting kind of squirrely, because we were suffering from fairly severe oxygen deprivation. That's the only thing I did not study before I went, which was what different levels of oxygen deprivation mean as far as your body functioning. And usually in the 60s, like 68 or so, they'll put you on O2. Our oxygen levels were in the 50s. So we were not going to be there very long, and which most people don't, unless you're just born in that environment and do it a lot. So started coming back down, and the funny little stories aside was just trying to video stuff and take pictures and whatnot, and actually just I didn't think it would happen. I didn't understand it, but I just completely lost control of my emotions while I'm like standing there and videoing it and going, "Oh my God, this is so stupid," But and part of that is oxygen deprivation, but I think part of it was just the fact that doing something so out of what I thought I would ever do in my life and accomplishing it. But we started making our way back down, and Scott, of course, was having a tough time at this point because part of the reason you ascend it so early in the morning is that the temperature there is hovering around anywhere from 20 below to 2 above. And when it gets really cold at night, this really brittle ground that makes up the side of the volcano is frozen solid. So it gives you better traction going up. But when the sun hits it, it becomes real loose. So then you're almost like you're kind of skiing through powder trying to come down the mountain and to go in a straight line versus traversing back and forth coming up. So get back to the tent, and of course, the guide that was with me that day, we got back what I thought was going to be a long while before Scott did. And I'd sat down. He brought me some tea. He was drinking some tea, having like apples or something like that. And all of a sudden, the tent opens, and it's Scott. I was like, "Whoa!" I mean, I'd only been there for like 10 or 15 minutes, and at this point, it had already gotten dark. And I looked at Scott, and it's like, "Wow, you must have like really run." And he's like, "Yeah." And he's just out of breath, and I'm like, still not thinking anything about it. And but I did notice that the team leader Joshua was just really intently just staring at him. And I was like, kind of said, "Is everything okay? What's going on?" And he said, "Scott's O2 level is not coming up." He said, as you go down the mountain, your O2 level comes up, but Scott is continually going down. And I said, "Well, what was it recently?" He said, "Well, I just checked it. It was 48." And I was like, "Oh, that doesn't sound good." He says, "Well, I'm going to give you 20 minutes." He says, "Scott, try to drink some water. Just rest for a minute." He goes, "I'll come back and then I test you again, okay?" So he had a little pulse oximeter to check our O2 levels. So I'm talking to Scott, and as I'm talking to him, he's still, it's kind of like I'm talking to a guy and he's just like somebody else who's listened to me talk to a guy. Just kind of weird because he's just kind of like, "Yeah, that's kind of his answers to questions." And it was at that point I noticed his breathing was just really this bizarre thing where his chest was just like, tuk, 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 tuk. And I said, "Scott, is that how you breathe, man?" I said, "That looks weird." And he's like, I don't know, man." It was within just a few minutes after that, Joshua comes back in. He checks his O2 reading again. And I just see just his face just like drops. And I'm like, "Well, what is it?" And Scott's like, how's it look?" He says, "Scott, this is not good because your O2 level is 36. And he says, Scott's like, what does that mean?" He's like, I need you, Scott, I need you to come with me and go back to the tent and lie down and tell me what you feel, okay?" He's like, "Oh, okay." So I'm still kind of oblivious to the fact and still had no cognizance of the fact that 38, I mean, you would be in a hospital with probably a respirator and all kinds of stuff going on at this point. And I hear this just gut wrenching from the other tent, and then it's just like Swahili. Guys are running around outside the tent, and I'm like, "Oh my god, oh my god!" And Joshua comes back in and opens the tent door, and he says, Michael, you must get Scott's things together. He must come off the mountain now, or he was going to die." I'm like, "What?" So I go in there and I'm packing his bag and everything. He goes and gets 6 guys that had stayed at base camp. There were 6 that went up with us. And the 6 that stayed at base camp, he went and told them that they had to take turns basically with Scott on their back to the next camp, which was 8 hours away. And so these 6 guys take off in the middle of the night with Scott on their back, and they're switching him out as they go there. Once they get to the next little town, it's called Harumbo, that one guy turns around and he walks all the way back, 8 hours back in the middle of the night, back to our base camp. The other 5 guys at this point then put Scott on a stretcher, put him in his mummy bag, and then carry him for another 8 hours down to the nearest road where they can meet a ranger to pick him up. And at that point, they take him to the hospital. The highest helipad in the world is at the base of Kilimanjaro Mountain. But because we had waited late to ascend and have a little bit more daylight time, it meant that we got back at dark. And the only problem with that is that you're so high at that elevation that, and when the nighttime rolls in, the atmosphere gets even lighter, and the helicopter couldn't get there to evacuate him. So that was the only thing that saved his life, were those 6 guys carrying him for 16 hours straight. But once he got down to the road, his O2 level had come back up to the mid 60s. So they're like, "Okay, you're going to be all right." Meanwhile, back at the ranch, I had to go to sleep that night, not knowing whether he died. So luckily, the next morning I woke up. My porter came and he had tea. He brought it to me, and he didn't say anything. And I was just like, "Oh God!" And then Joshua comes in, "Michael, it's okay. Scott is good." Like, "Oh, thank God, man." All right, cool. The interesting thing though is that, and it wasn't until after the fact, but one of the things with Scott is that he, like I said, he had that little bit of peripheral vision that was left. And um, probably the thing that pushed him into total blindness was this trip, because it did mention that having oxygen deprivation at a sustained amount and stuff like that has caused people with sight, full sight, to lose their sight. So for him, that was his last sighted trip up a mountain.
Oh my gosh. Wow. What a story. That is absolutely amazing. And inspiring, something that was an idea that you had a friend call and ask, would you be willing to do this? And for you guys to take that journey and trek together, um, and come down the other side, and he's okay. The ending of the story is that he's okay, and it's a
Yeah.
memory that he shares with you that you'll have forever. And that's a great story. So, Mike, what advice would you give someone that is thinking about taking on a challenge that seems just so far out there? Whether it's climbing the highest mountain or taking on something else, what advice would you give them?
Um, for me, I'll kind of default back on my liberal arts training, and it's learn as much about it as you can. Um, I thought that I had all the bases covered. I thought I had equipment that I needed, and the different kind of specified things that were on the checklists and stuff like that. My little bit of an oversight basically cost me two big toenails, because it wasn't until after I got back I realized not only had I climbed Mount Kilimanjaro and completely uh, traversed the largest single standing mountain in the world, but I had also done so wearing boots that were too small.
Oh my
And
God.
unfortunately, I never figured that out because I was just doing short, 2-hour hikes. But when you're talking about being in a situation where you're walking downhill for 8 hours, essentially it was like somebody getting a little vice and putting it on your toenail and doing like that for 8 hours. So it took a while to get over that. So, I mean, really, and I think that kind of like, you know, whether it's a business venture or whether it's some sort of expedition or even a romantic endeavor. I mean, whatever it is, you got to learn as much as you can about what you're going after and the situation that surrounds it, because the more stuff that you can mitigate that could pop up and bite you, the better the journey is, and the journey is what you remember more than really the getting to the desired object that you're trying to achieve, I think.
No, that's great advice. And, I think it's important to point out that folks that start out on this expedition to climb Mount Kilimanjaro don't make it. There's a good pocket of folks that don't get to the top. They have issues. They have to, there's lots of reasons why they don't make it. Do you happen to know the statistics of how many people actually reach the peak?
It's less than 50%. So when I got ready to go, one of the things that was kind of daunting to me was as I was kind of going through and reading articles and just trying to fill my little goodie bag of knowledge, basically. One of the articles I came across was Martina Navratilova, world, tennis phenom and just an incredible athlete. And she didn't make it, and she said she would never try anything like that ever again. So I read this whole article, and she was just like, "It's the hardest thing I've ever done in my entire life." And I was like, "Oh my god, what am I doing?" But then my saving grace is that it was probably a few weeks after reading that. I was watching, I think, NBC, and they're like, "And today we're going to be talking to Mandy Moore, and she's going to talk to us about going to Kilimanjaro and climbing to the top." And I'm like, "Oh, I can do this. I'm not going to let Mandy Moore beat me. This is not going to happen." So luckily, it was like a really good moment of just kind of one of those things kind of pushing me in the back of my mind where I was kind of almost talking myself out of it a little bit, like, God, do I really want to do this? I mean, here's somebody who's spent their life being in like top physical condition, but it comes down to a lot of things that um, part of it was a little bit of dumb luck, and that my mom happened to reach out to me right before I left too and said, "Have you talked to your uncle?" And I'm like, "No, I haven't talked to him." And why? And she said, "Well, he used to lead youth groups up to the troubled kids up to the tops of the mountains and stuff in Colorado." And I'm like, "Oh my God, you're right. I completely forgot about that." So luckily, and I think it was one of the reasons that for me I didn't have the issues that Scott had, was that he talked to me about rhythmic breathing, and that made a huge difference in the way that I was able to approach the mountain, because I was able to control my breathing more, and it kind of takes some of the, it's almost it becomes like a chant or a mantra in your head, because you're having to make sure that you don't breathe any more than you're walking. So if you're taking 3 steps, you're inhaling for 3 and then you're exhaling for 3. You never get into a situation where you're walking faster than you're breathing, because when you're doing that, it starts basically putting your body into a situation where you're burning up more oxygen than you're taking in, and that's how you get high altitude sickness. So that was like a real fortunate, 11th hour thing that kind of came across the desk. My mom going, "Well, have you talked to your uncle?" And I'm like, "No, I haven't." But so it really pays to learn as much as possible about anything that you're going to go into like that.
Absolutely.
And it also helps for us. Scott had done a lot of research on the front end, and the guys that we went with were highly, they had just great reviews and stuff. And when we were there, this was the last time that they were going to be working for someone else. And they started their own company called Kilimanjaro Experts. So, again, if anyone is interested in going off in that particular direction and wanting to try something like that, I would not recommend anyone higher than those guys, strictly because, I mean, they saved my friend's life. And everything that they did in the planning stage and the ascent and coming back down was very thoughtful. We ran into a couple of groups where, when we were right near the top, there was a woman that was just walking down the face of the mountain by herself. And Joshua was just like, "This is not right. She should not be by herself." But they're, like in anything, they're unscrupulous, people that are running these kind of things, and they won't hire the amount of staff that you should have to be able to do it safely. And so there was like 2 people, and there was only one person that went up with them. So if both of them went down, who brings the other one down? If they both got sick. And what I was able to see with this whole situation is that even seasoned pros, and we ran into some of those, because everybody goes to a certain hamburger place once you get back to Arusha, and everybody gets their certificates and stuff signed by the guide, and it's signed by the park service and all this kind of stuff that you made the ascent. And we were at a small table, and Scott and I and 3 or 4 of the guys. There was a big table with a bunch of dudes from Belgium at the other, and they're all, "Oh, blah, 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 blah," toasting and doing all these beers. And one of the guys comes over, one of the tour guides comes to our table, and he starts talking to Joshua. And he's talking in English a little bit, then he starts talking in Swahili to him. And I see Joshua kind of rolling his eyes a little bit, and he's like, "Okay, all right, okay, okay." And so the guy walks off, and I was like, "What was that all about?" He's like, he was talking stuff about us, man." He said, he was saying, "Oh, look at you. You only got 2 people in your group. Look at my group. I'm so much better than you." And I was like, "Well, that doesn't mean anything." He goes, "No, it does not mean anything." He said, "Did you notice his hands?" I said, "No, I didn't." He says, "He only has 2 fingers." And it was because 6 months ago, this guy had been doing it his entire life. He got caught in a snowstorm on the top, got lost, and he got frostbite and lost all but 2 of his fingers. So he's like, "I think that I am doing better than him." It's like,
I would say
it's like,
so.
I would say you are.
Oh, wow. Well, we like to end the podcast with um, an opportunity for some comic relief. We all enjoy hearing inspiring stories, but when we wrap up the podcast, we like to have some comedy. So I'm wondering, Mike, if you have a funny story um, on your journey that you'd be willing to share with us.
Yeah, there was something that was pretty fun. I actually videotaped this. So we had, along with photos, we had part of this. It was like a whole video thing montage was going on too. But we had been walking for a while, and it was kind of funny because when we first got on the bus, we have all these porters, and they're just kind of looking at us, and I'm sure they were looking at me like, you know, God, I hope that guy doesn't go down because it's going to take like five of us to carry him off the mountain. But after we drove there, and it was very quiet. But after the first day of hiking, we start talking to each other. We're asking about families, politics, things in the world, and then it's probably like day three. We've been walking for quite a while, and one of the things that you realize is that a lot of Disney movies, especially like Lion King and stuff like that, they use Swahili. Like Hakuna Matata is actually Swahili, and they say it all the time, Hakuna Matata, and all this kind of stuff. So Scott was like walking along, and I'd been videoing for a few minutes, and he's up there, and one of the guys is walking with him, and he says, he's like, so Scott's like, so tell me, man, how is it? How do you say this? And he's like, "Hakuna matuto machanda do balaba," whatever it was. And Scott's like, "Chupa mata kabala baba," and he's like, he goes, no, no, no. And so they're going back and forth, and then Scott turns around and to me and says this stuff in Swahili to me. And so I stop and I'm like, Scott, dude, you need to just cut this out. He's like, what? No, I'm trying to learn. I'm like, no, man, you don't know. This guy's probably telling you that you're going to be walking around, walking up to people going, hi, my name is Scott. My mother is a goat, or something crazy like that. And the guy, I was like, that's what's going on, isn't it? And the guy's like, I was like, yeah, you're busted, man. You're busted. It's like, yeah, you might want to like get your Swahili book out before you go spouting it at the restaurant when we get back. There's no telling what's going to happen, dude.
Oh,
So,
that's great.
but
Yeah.
yeah, just good natured fun between people that were just on a expedition together, and we wanted to get to the top, and they wanted us to get to the top because that's a source of pride for these guys. That it's just unbelievable when you think about it. They do it every other week, and for us, one evening I sat down and did the math, and Joshua had been doing this for 17 years, every other week for 17 years. And so I extrapolated out the height of the mountain and then did that every other week and then multiplied it all together. And it was something like crazy. I mean, basically, he's walked from the distance from the earth to the moon, and the number
Wow.
of times he's taken people up and down Mount Kilimanjaro. So, and I put it to him that way, and he's like, "Oh, I think I've really done something." Like, yes, you have, man. It's incredible. So,
Wow. Wow. Such a great story. And you guys really did it. So you made it to the top of Mount Kilimanjaro and
and
sounds like a
Scott's still doing it. He sent me a picture the other day. He was on one of the volcanoes outside of Antigua in Guatemala, and off in the distance you see it blowing up, and he's like pointing at it. He can't see it, but he's pointing at it. And I'm like, Scott, you're crazy, man. But I still climb, and maybe within the next year, depending on how things pan out with what's going on now and whatnot, I would like to go climb Aconcagua if I can, and that's the tallest mountain in the world outside of Tibet. It's the highest in the Western Hemisphere and the highest in South America. So
wow. Wow.
that's my next big if I can pull that in. That may be the end of extreme mountain climbing for me. I don't know. The other ones after that when you do the 7 summits are pretty hardcore. So I don't, I enjoy it, but I don't want to die doing it basically.
Well, I appreciate you sharing your story with us, Mike. Thank you for being on this episode of Goalpost
Sure.
and just inspiring others. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was fun.
Great. Thank you.